As I said, I'm Dr. Sanjeev Kagram. I'm the Director General and Dean of the Thunderbird School of Global Management. I'm really honored to have the privilege to introduce this webinar today and then pass it over to our distinguished speaker and faculty member as well, who will moderate, Professor Landry Signe. If we could go back and to our agenda, please. So I'm gonna do the introduction welcome. We'll have a keynote address by His Excellency Wamkele Mene, and then the discussion will be moderated by Professor Landry Signe. Why don't I also just say a few more words about why, for us, our partnership with Africa is so critical at this time. Number one, we know that the future of the world depends on every region being an active participant in creating the kind of sustainable and equitable prosperity that we believe in and is our core vision. Number two, if you look at what's happening across the continent and the tremendous energy and innovation and transformations that are underway pre-COVID and even despite the pandemic, it truly is one of the most exciting places on the planet for private sector, for government, new forms of governance, for new forms of civic action. Number three is that if we are true to our core principle of bringing the world together, that borders frequented by trade seldom need soldiers. And certainly the pandemic, if anything, has shown that where we may not be completely borderless, borders are easily traversed, both for the ill and for the good. That we have to be engaged with with humility and as servants with partners around the world. And so that's why we're so excited about this particular webinar, because of a brand new and one of the very, amongst recent years, the first new international institutions that is really advancing a sustainable and equitable trade agenda, free trade agenda, and in this case, across the African continent. Now, the other part I want to share with you, as you know, as we've transformed Thunderbird, for most of you, the #1 school for global management as part of Arizona State University, the #1 university for innovation, and the #1 university in the United States for the SDGs and impact, global impact. We are setting up and establishing regional centers of excellence across the world, 20 to 25. We currently have 12 around the world, including a very, very powerful one in Nairobi, Kenya, led by Tigo Philip and Monica Retz-Macau, supported by Olivia Mulwera, and many others across the school, Femi Babarinde, of course, Landry Signe. And so this is very important to us in the months and years ahead. Our goal is to have 3 more, one in West Africa, one in North Africa, one in Southern Africa. And we look forward to partnering as we have been with the World Economic Forum in Africa, as you see, United Nations, several major private sector companies, and the Titans, as I mentioned before. If I go to the next slides where I can have the bio for our distinguished speakers, and you could skip me. So without further ado, then let me introduce His Excellency Mr. Wamkele Mene was elected as the first Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area on February 10th, 2020 by the 33rd Assembly of the African Heads of State. His Excellency is a multilateral trade and development professional with almost 2 decades of experience in implementation of the Southern African Customs Union Agreement, the Southern African Development Community Protocol on Trade, and the World Trade Organization agreements. Again, it's a beacon of light and hope and inspiration in this world where trade and free trade, albeit free and fair trade, has been under attack, where borders have become more of the focus, where the rise of nationalisms and populisms have begun to divide, has advanced a division and discord. And so why we're so thrilled and honored to have His Excellency with us is to share his vision of setting this really 21st century institution to promote regional and global free trade, free and fair trade. And also his, how he's trying to do that, how we might, all of us, support him and this great new institution. Without further ado, actually, let me just introduce Professor Signe so he can just take the reins. I personally, and we are so thrilled and honored to have Professor Signe join the Thunderbird School. He's had an incredibly distinguished career, a young global leader with the World Economic Forum, one of the youngest full professors at the University of Alaska, perhaps ever, a distinguished fellow at Stanford University, and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. If you get a chance, please do read his publications, most recent on the impacts of COVID and the fourth industrial revolution, on globalization 4.0. He's really our anchor for our work in the world and around trade and development. So Landry, thank you so much for organizing this and being part of our great Thunderbird Global family. If I could, before I pass over to Wamkele, I was mentioning that the Minister of Trade of Rwanda, Soraya, is our distinguished alum. We've talked a lot about trade issues across the continent. She also was our commencement speaker very recently when we did our avatar robot ceremonies, trying to embrace both physical health, safety, and the fourth industrial revolution. So we have 45,000 alumni around the world in 140 countries, including a very, very distinguished set across the continent. And so I hope that many of them could sign in today and welcome them. Without further ado then, please over to you, Your Excellency. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dean, and thank you to everybody for arranging this webinar and for inviting me. I would have rather been there in person, but the circumstances do not allow that for now. I think it is, I started this job on the 11th of March, when the COVID-19 pandemic was beginning to rear its head in Africa. And so in preparation for my swearing-in ceremony and the statement that I delivered at the swearing-in ceremony, I had to completely change from priorities from what I had set out during the campaign period late last year, to take account of the state of the world today, and in particular, to take account of the impact of all of that in the priorities that we had before in terms of the trade and economic development objectives of Africa. And I will talk a little bit about that. I was struck by something you said in your introduction, and that is the importance of this African continental free trade area for a number of reasons. Of course, development in nature is the end objective, but I think there are also very, very critical objectives that the agreement seeks to achieve. First and foremost, we want to overcome market fragmentation in Africa. We want to make sure that the agreement takes us a step closer to what will in future be a single market in Africa. We want to make sure that we place Africa on an industrial development path that will ensure that we reduce our reliance on the export of primary commodities, primarily to countries of the North, Europe in particular. We want to build an Africa that will actually start producing value-added goods and start exporting value-added goods. And we believe that through implementing this agreement and a robust industrial development action plan and robust industrial development strategy, Africa will be able to significantly increase intra-Africa trade from the low 18% where it stands now to a much, much higher rate of intra-Africa trade, which as a goal, we have set that by 2030, intra-Africa trade should be at 50%, 52%, and hopefully above. And we think it's possible to achieve that objective if we focus on industrial development, if we focus on inclusive participation and inclusive growth, and inclusive benefit of all the potential outcomes of this agreement. We think that all countries in Africa have the potential to reap the benefits of this agreement. If you look, for example, at how some value chains are developed, there are many countries in Africa that are not exporters of automobiles, and yet a country like Lesotho is actually on the automobile regional value chain in Southern Africa with South Africa. And Lesotho does not have an auto assembly infrastructure. They do not have at least to my knowledge, they do not have an auto strategy for developing the auto industry. I make an example because Lesotho is a relatively smaller country compared to South Africa, both in terms of GDP per capita and also population size, and yet Lesotho is on the regional value chain on automobiles. There are other examples that we can think of, agro-processing, for example, even in the area of services. So it's very important that if we want to achieve the objectives of this agreement, which is overcoming smallness of our individual markets, overcoming the fragmentation that we have had in our markets, and achieving economies of scale, we have to step up our efforts at integrating our market. And I think industrial development is a very important part of that. If we are not able to ensure that as many countries as possible benefit from this agreement, we will end up in a situation very similar to what you've described in your opening remarks, and that is that the agreement will benefit only countries like South Africa, like Kenya, like Egypt, Morocco, that already have an industrial base relative to the others, that already have a manufacturing and capacity. And we have to avoid that mistake. We've got to make sure, as I was just saying earlier, that there is inclusive benefit in this agreement. At a very micro level, that means that to avoid a similar situation as we saw in Europe and some parts of the world, the rise of right-wing, chauvinistic, nationalist parties who are able to leverage on the rejection of globalization by communities around the world, who leverage the rejection of trade agreements by communities around the world. We have to learn from that mistake. And I believe the one way in which we can learn from that mistake is by bringing in all segments of our society, particularly in our context in Africa. We bring in young Africans in trade. We bring in women in trade. We bring in informal trade. We bring in small and medium enterprises. And when during my statement after the election, this is what I committed myself to doing. If we cannot get young Africans, women in trade, small, medium enterprises, if we don't get them to be part of the implementation of this agreement, it is very possible that the agreement will be rejected by Africans. And it is very possible that we will actually create a context very similar to the conditions that we saw in some parts of Europe, which gave rise to the right-wing regimes that we have seen around the world that advance very narrow nationalist imperatives, which in our context as Africa, this would be a very dangerous contribution to a situation that is already very dire, particularly in terms of employment for young Africans. And so, as a matter of principle, this is something that I have committed myself to. Now, we have to take account, as I said earlier, of where we are. the African Continental Free Trade Area was scheduled to be operationalized from the 1st of July this year, starting to trade from the 1st of July this year. All of that now seems that it will not be possible. We have recommended to heads of states that myself and Commissioner Muchanga, we have recommended that heads of states should relook at this date because of the current conditions on the ground do not allow. Borders are closed across the African continent. The entire continent is in a lockdown with the exception of a few countries. And so really the conditions are not conducive to trade at this moment. But we are waiting for heads of states to tell us, to give us a new directive. And I'm hoping in the next few days, we will get a new directive as to a trading date itself. As you know, Africa we were growing, we were on track for very high growth of our services sector. It is now very, very negatively affected. Our estimates as African Union is that the services sector in Africa will experience reductions or fall between 20 to 30%. And here I'm talking about travel services, the airline industry, hospitality. So this is going to have a very, very negative impact on the services sector in Africa. The World Bank has estimated that sub-Saharan growth in Africa will fall by a little over 5%, and further estimate that we will experience losses between 40 to 70 billion dollars this year as a result of the crisis of the pandemic. Our export market is very, very badly affected, as we all know. Many countries that Africa exports to have themselves experienced very, very low growths in the last 2 to 3 months in terms of output, economic output. And so this has affected our export markets. We export about 53% of our exports go to these traditional markets. And so when they are affected, certainly as Africa, we ourselves are affected. We have also seen evidence of capital flight, particularly in the last month. And that has an impact, obviously, on the country's broader macroeconomic standing. It is something that has affected us once again in a different way in terms of the flows of investment into Africa. The global supply trade that we were relying on have been disrupted, and all of these things that I've mentioned, the aggregate of all of these issues is what prompted me on the 19th of May in my statement during my swearing in to say the following. First, we have to look at this crisis as an opportunity for Africa to reconfigure our supply chains, to reconfigure our industrial development and the establishment and accelerate the establishment of regional value chains, focusing on priority sectors. It means that we must really focus on being less reliant on others without completely disconnecting from the global economy, because that would be counterproductive. But we've got to start accelerating our industrial development objectives and the establishment of regional value chains in Africa so that we are able to produce all of this equipment that is critical for fighting the pandemic, so that we can produce it in Africa, so that we produce the ventilators in Africa. We produce the personal protection equipment in Africa. The germ killing products, we produce all of those in Africa. So as a long-term strategy, I think that it is really critical that we look at this pandemic as an opportunity for us to move very rapidly in that direction. The second point is linked to that, and that is we should see this as an opportunity to reconfigure or to review our intellectual property regime so that our intellectual property regime serves our public policy objectives, our public health objectives, and also so that our intellectual property rights regime, and I mean here in particular patents, so that they are at the service of industrial development in Africa. And this is something that other countries have done it in other parts of the world. They have leveraged on a patents regime that enables the establishment of a generic drug industry. Last year alone, Africa imported over $15 billion worth of pharmaceuticals. I don't think that in the long term that is sustainable. It's not sustainable in the context of a pandemic, as we are seeing now, and it's not sustainable even in ordinary times. We should be able to develop our own self-reliance, again, without disconnecting with the rest of the world. We should be able to establish our own generic drug industry that will serve the purpose, the dual purpose of developing our industrial sectors, but also ensuring through the generic drugs that we produce, ensuring that public health is addressed. So in the long term, these are the priorities for addressing the pandemic as I see them. In the short term, what our heads of states and ourselves, the Secretariat and in the African Union, what we have done is working with the African Center for Disease Control and Prevention. We have developed a list of essential goods, products that are required by every country to fight the pandemic. These are the soaps, germ-killing products, and we have advised ministers of trade that these are the products that should be allowed transit through borders in the shortest period of time, so that all countries in Africa can have access at a very affordable prices. We have also recommended that these products, these essential goods, must be allowed to transit through trade corridors. On the 11th of April this year, the heads of states, the Assembly of Heads of States, agreed that there should be these trade corridors. And so these trade corridors must facilitate the movement of these essential goods to reach countries that are landlocked and to reach countries that don't have immediate access to them. This is a very critical tool for fighting the pandemic. So this is in the immediate and short term, this is what we are advising the ministers. The third tool which we are advising the ministers is to consider, for each country to consider a reduction or a moratorium on duties on these essential products, so that for a period of time, these essential products can transit through the borders and transit relatively quickly and become more affordable to Africans up and down this great continent, so that again we're able to have a coordinated fight against the pandemic. And so although the start of trading may be delayed, it may be delayed depending on what the heads of states are going to say. But we think that focusing on these essential products and focusing all our efforts on ensuring that these trade corridors, that they actually are operational and that they have the desired effect. These are the three immediate steps that we would have to take. So let me conclude by making an observation, which again, Dean, you made earlier. One of the reasons why this agreement is different is because we have looked at most trade agreements around the world, including the WTO, and we have crafted an agreement that takes into account things that most trade agreements have not explicitly taken into account. For example, I have an obligation as the Secretary General to ensure that the things that I was mentioning, that I assist member states to develop value chains, that I assist member states to accelerate industrial development, not only at a national and regional level, but pan-African industrial development focus. There are very few trade agreements that have that create that obligation, that are able to translate an economic development objective into and codify it into a legal obligation. So this is one of the reasons why this agreement is different. I can give you another example. In the area of intellectual property rights, we will be able, we are not there yet in crafting the IP chapter, but we will be able to craft an IP chapter which will enable us to achieve all of those things that in the WTO have been very difficult to achieve. For example, the parallel importing of generic drugs, compulsory licensing of drugs for to advance public health objectives. These are things in the WTO, a place where I spent 6 years negotiating, where we were not able to get an effective solution to development challenges in Africa. And so I think we have an opportunity as Africans to craft an agreement that will significantly advance our development objectives, even in areas such as in the WTO, where we were not able to get consensus. The third reason why I think this is different is because of the nature in which we negotiated it. I don't think that any particular country will say we felt bulldozed or this, or our views were not accommodated. We negotiated this agreement in less than 5 years, and ratified by 28 countries out of 55, and signed by 54 countries out of 55. It is an agreement that was negotiated in a relatively quick period of time, because it actually is a long-standing objective of Africa to put into action an action plan for Africa's integration. And so if you look at Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, the African Continental Free Trade Area is one of the flagship projects, and has been identified as one of the tools for taking Africa a step closer to the Africa we want, as set out in Agenda 2063. What is interesting about this agreement, and what is interesting about what Africa and what we as Africans have done, is that whilst the rest of the world is moving backwards, whilst the rest of the world is increasing tariffs, we are reducing tariffs. While we see a rise in protectionism, we as Africans are decreasing protectionism in Africa. While we see a regulation of investment flow in a way that seeks to protect particular countries, we are going to craft an investment chapter that will facilitate intra-Africa investment, and of course investment of the others that may come outside of the region. And so we now have an interesting context where the African continent has become the defender of multilateralism. We have become the defender of global trade rules, as imperfect as they are, and as much as they have not always served our interests as African countries. We took the WTO rules, we improved on them, and we made them sui generis to our own context in Africa. And by so doing, I believe that we actually have strengthened the multilateral trading system, and that we have come out clearly in defense of maintenance of and upholding global trade rules, because we know that without global trade rules and without adhering to trade rules either in our regions or multilaterally outside in the WTO, we are going to be the losers. And so these are some of the reasons why I believe this agreement is distinguishable from some arrangements that we've seen around the world. There will be challenges, of course. That is absolutely inevitable. There will be implementation challenges. There will be challenges in terms of the effect, the balance of payments effect of this agreement and opening trade and reducing tariffs. These are challenges. There will be dispute settlement related challenges. There will be trade remedies related challenges. And so we should expect that there will be all of these types of challenges as we implement the agreement. And so to conclude on a point that, again, you raised earlier, where will the stimulus package for Africa come from? The US announced a stimulus package of close to $3 trillion, $60 billion for the airline industry in the form of grants and loans. The European Union has also announced a substantial stimulus package. Very, very few countries in Africa have the monetary policy space, the fiscal policy space to put in place such critical interventions. And so our intervention as Africa, our stimulus package, is implementing this agreement as soon as possible, as soon as conditions allow, and implementing it in such a way that we actually significantly improve intra-Africa trade. This is that's it. That's all we have in a Pan-African sense, is implementation of this agreement, reducing trade barriers amongst one another, reducing barriers to investment amongst one another. That is it. That is the stimulus package that we have. And I know that a lot of heads of states will support us in expeditiously implementing the agreement. So thank you very much. I look forward to an exchange of views. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wamkele. It's just a tour de force, really, in terms of the insights, but also, you know, the challenges and opportunities that face not only Africa, but the world in terms of where we are in terms of the pandemic. But I really appreciate three things. One is the rigor and the systematic nature of your analysis. Number two, the optimism and the pragmatism of the approach that you are bringing forward to take not only the institution forward, but the continent forward. But three, also a really critical focus on how Africa can be a beacon of inspiration and hope for the rest of the world in terms of turning the tide towards a more sustainable and inclusive globalism and regionalism in the case of Africa. I think want to say that there's a tremendous number of fantastic questions with Landry we'll share with you and get your insights on. We also have many in the chat box. I want to reintroduce our two leaders in the Nairobi Center, Philip Tigo and Professor Monica Koretz-Macau. There are some questions around many other areas outside of trade, like what's the future of educational institutions in Africa. Please do look at all the webinars, globinars that Professor Macau and Dr. Philip have been organizing, Tigo, across Africa. Many of those topics have already been addressed, but also will continue to be addressed. With that, I want to thank you again, Wamkele. I'm going to pass it over to you, Professor Signe, to moderate the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jean Kagram. And I would like to congratulate you again, Excellency, for a distinguished and very insightful keynote. And I do agree with you that with the African Continental Free Trade Area, Africa is definitively showing leadership in the world stage in matters of trade through unity. And it is a step towards the One Africa, which has been dreamed since independence. So you are a leader with deep insights and experience in building consensus among stakeholders who have competitive or competing objectives. And your ability also to influence result has been demonstrated in many of your other appointments and positions. So I think that it would have been difficult to have a better Secretary General than you. So, and I congratulate you on the position. As Winston Churchill said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So what are some of the ways in which the pandemic can be used as an opportunity for the African Continental Free Trade Area on one hand, and for Africa as a whole on another, knowing that you have highlighted some of the points, especially for Africa in general. So from a AfCFTA perspective, but also broadly the continent, what are the key opportunities?
Well, thank you very much. I think, again, to reiterate an earlier point, this is an opportunity for us to accelerate how we trade one another, and also to accelerate the development of regional industrial chains and industrial linkages. There's no African country that will be able to sustain itself, whether in a pandemic or not. There's no single African country that can singularly sustain itself without trade with the rest of the region and with the rest of Africa. And so we have to ensure that we, in the development of our industries, which is now underscored, the need to do that is underscored by this crisis, we have to make sure that we develop specializations. It is no longer we should not be, one of the reasons why intra-Africa trade is so low, amongst others, is because I produce apples, you produce apples, and I want to export apples to you. So we've got to develop and structure our industrial strategy and our industrial development strategy in the way that we encourage specialization, and in a way that we focus on what a country's value chain and value proposition is. I mentioned the example earlier of Lesotho. There are other examples in agro-processing. The country that I am in, Ethiopia, is another example of the potential for agro-processing, whether you are talking about leather products that are processed and there's value addition that is undertaken. There are various examples that one can cite for how this crisis underscores the fact that we need to move very, very quickly. It's an opportunity to move quickly on our industrial development path. The other area that I think of, which is again an opportunity and which this crisis has underscored, is digitization and e-commerce. If you look at the new innovations, even before COVID-19, you go to a country like Rwanda, and you will see young Africans who are at the forefront of innovation for financial technology platforms, for all types of economic activity, that innovation in digitization. what we have seen in this crisis is innovations such as remote visiting your doctor, digital pharmacies, and so on. So I think we've seen evidence in this crisis. We've seen evidence that e-commerce and digitization is a very important part of Africa's economy. And so we have to create the regulatory framework, a Pan-African regulatory framework, which doesn't exist now. We have to establish a Pan-African regulatory framework for e-commerce, for digitization, so that investors can feel comfortable to come in and invest and to stimulate our e-commerce. There are a number of examples that I can cite, which again, this crisis underscores for us to vigorously pursue. I mentioned intellectual property rights. I mentioned patents, and patents as a public health tool potentially, and patents as a tool for industrial development, and patents as a tool for digital trade and industrial activity. So this is these are the areas that I think have become a priority and have to be a priority in terms of acceleration of implementation. So I think what the crisis has added more things for me to do, has added to my to-do list. But we are very determined as Africans. We're very determined to implement this agreement, and we're very determined to make sure that that it succeeds.
That's great. So you mentioned digitalization, which I think is extremely important. So do you think that it is possible to explore, to officially commit to a phase 3 negotiation, for example, on e-commerce? And also, to what extent health services could be included formally in the list of priority sectors in service negotiation? So this is to connect with the point that you have already elaborated, but another question, which is also related to the timeliness of COVID-19, is related to the fact that a certain number of governments have pushed back against the proposition to postpone the launch of the CFTA. So what is your response to this government, and what will you consider to make sure that the broader CFTA doesn't lose the momentum?
The decision to postpone the date of trading is a decision that will have to be taken by the heads of states. And I'm sure they will take everything into account. What I can say is that it is very difficult to trade when borders are closed. If borders are closed and we say we are trading on the 1st of July, it seems to me that that is not a credible declaration to make, given the current context. Given where we are with the pandemic, given where we are with the border closures, given where we are with the focus of many governments across the African continent with a focus on public health and fighting the pandemic, which is quite sensibly and quite responsibly what all governments should be doing anyway. So I don't know what the heads of states will say, but what I do know is that the conditions on the ground are clear for everybody to see. What we ought to be focusing on for the 1st of July are those essential goods, the public health related goods, and the essential pandemic fighting products. I think those should be the priorities for now. That is what we should be focusing on. In terms of health services, it's clear that if we want to take a long-term strategy or medium to long-term strategy for fighting the pandemic, health services becomes key, and the movement of health professionals also becomes very, very key. So we have to make sure that in the context of the services negotiations, health professionals are prioritized, temporary movement of health professionals. The phase 3, which is for now e-commerce, is the decision was that it will be part of phase 3. And it is, as I was saying earlier, it has clearly become a very, very important part of the negotiations. It facilitates investment in a range of areas, and it, in fact, it is something that is not divorced from trade in services. So we are looking at it. We have to look at it in that context. So I think the health services is going to become also a new area of priority in the context of the negotiations.
Excellent. So I have many questions left, but I will mix them with the question from the audience. So let me start with a question by Martin Bayer. How can the Kenya Digital Economy Blueprint help to accelerate the formation of a continental digital free trade area in the context of the AfCFTA? So, and I will submit a few questions so that you can connect them while answering. Another question by Gerald Shirinda. How are you planning on reaching out to young Africans with regards to the CFTA and its benefits? And a question by Mireille Chosi-Nima. So how do you intend to address the peace and security challenges that will likely emerge out of the implementation of the AfCFTA, especially with the ongoing security threats and terrorist attack affecting women, youth, and children on the continent?
Okay, thank you very much, and for all those questions. The blueprint for the digital economy and digitization and Kenya's progress, we are going to look at all African countries' existing models on e-commerce and digitization. There are innovations, there are pockets of innovations that are happening in terms of digitization across the African continent. There are countries who are introducing digitization of customs procedures. There are countries that are introducing what they call electronic certificates of origin. And so our job will be to look at all of these best practices and to formulate and to craft a platform for Africa that takes into account the various pockets of excellence that exist, that already exist in Africa. Of course, there will be challenges because we are at different levels of progress and different levels of rolling out digitization in Africa. The African Union has a strategy for digitization that also will be taken into account. I think the difference here will be that this will be a legally binding text that will be applicable throughout the African continent. The role of young Africans. Here, I want to create a dialogue with young Africans in trade, which will be based on a country and a region, because I want to hear from young Africans what their ideas also are to complement our thinking as a secretariat. So I think the first step is not to assume that I have all the answers in relation to young Africans in trade. The first step is to create a platform and to create a dialogue for young Africans to tell us in their minds what it is that we should be facilitating as we implement this agreement. How do we facilitate their participation? So this dialogue, regional and country level dialogue, is very important for that purpose of engaging young Africans. The last question on peace and security. As you know, this year, 2020, is according to the Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. This year is the year of silencing the guns. And there was scheduled a summit on the 30th of May, a summit on silencing the guns. Unfortunately, it appears that that summit may not happen because of COVID-19. And the purpose of the summit was to take stock in where the progress we have made or not in terms of peace and security, because I think the underlying point to the question, if I may be presumptuous, the underlying point is that without peace and security on the continent, you cannot trade. And that is absolutely the case, that we need to ensure that we adhere to silencing the guns 2020, so that economic prosperity can take place in Africa. And I, as any other African, I am encouraged by the progress that has been made in silencing the guns. There are, of course, still pockets of concern, but I think for the most part, there is a realization that if we do not ensure that we silence the guns, we will not be able to have a conducive trading arrangement.
That's fabulous. So the last round of questions. So Excellency Kefala Yansan, Ambassador of the Republic of Guinea in the United States, inquire about the infrastructure gap. So how the CFTA could help bridging that gap. So another question by Philip Chigo, the Director for Africa at Thunderbird. Is the CFTA Secretary advising member states to invest in digital public goods, noting that we are in a technology enhanced world, also understanding that Africa is relatively youthful. So this is another very important question. And other questions include, can you give us an update as to when you expect the remaining phases, 1 and 2 elements of the negotiation to be finalized? So what do you envision may be the stumbling block? And in order to start the operational phase, do you think that it is important to first finalize tariffs of concession and rules of origin?
Thank you once again for really another round of excellent questions. Starting with infrastructure, we are already having discussions with interested multilateral banks on infrastructure development. The infrastructure deficit in Africa is quite high. And if we're talking about trade and transiting goods, we need to ensure that the infrastructure facilitates that trade. And so it's very important that as we implement the agreement, we partner with institutions that will provide the infrastructure and that is required, and that will provide the investment in the infrastructure that is required. And there are already a number of multilateral banks in Africa who are very keen to work with us to develop a very clear, actionable strategy for infrastructure development in Africa. In terms of the digital platforms, of course, individual countries also have a role to play. But I think the Secretariat, our role is to facilitate the Pan-African digitization, and even if that means that it may mean also establishing platforms, a Pan-African platform for encouraging digital trade. But as I noted earlier, there are individual countries that are already engaged in digitization of their economy or digitization of their trade. And so it is important that we build on those individual country successes and we roll them out across the African continent, again, to ensure that digital trade is a very important part of rolling out trade in Africa. Already there are success stories in countries like Uganda of farmers, of women traders who use digital technology to access their markets in other parts of the country. So already there is evidence that digital platforms do make a very significant contribution to trade, either in region or in country. The phase 2 and phase 1. Phase 2 is to be concluded at the end of next year. Commissioner Muchanga, my colleague, is responsible for the negotiations, along with His Excellency, the President of Niger, President Issoufou. They are working very hard to make sure that we meet the deadlines that were set by the heads of states for phase 1 and for phase 2. Unfortunately, because of COVID-19, I don't think anybody can anticipate when borders will open again and when we will be able to resume our work. But I think the point that I want to underscore is that we've got to have a credible trading, because anybody can make an assessment of trade flows. If you make a big announcement and you say we're trading on a certain date and there are no trade flows, the whole process is not credible. So we have to make sure that it is credible. We have to make sure that the trade flows are there. We have to make sure that the rules of origin are concluded, the negotiations. We have to make sure that the tariff reduction negotiations are concluded, so that we can have a very, very credible and a very, very good starting point of intra-Africa trade. So my advice is, let us get everything that let us conclude our work. Let us focus on the essential goods in the meantime, but for the comprehensive trading, let us trade comprehensively when the conditions are appropriate for that and when the conditions allow. But again, I stress that is a decision in terms of postponement. That is a decision of heads of states and not mine.
Wamkele, I will not let you go without asking you perhaps a more personal question. So, as a Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area, how have your priorities, ideas for the CFTA changed compared to the moment that you were officially appointed? And also you have demonstrated extraordinary leadership skills in your previous appointments. How do you envision using those skills to move forward toward a successful CFTA? And finally, do you have a specific request for African or US or global policymakers, business and academic leaders? How can we help you achieving your mission?
Well, thank you. I think one of the things that I have had to transition from is taking off my hat as a former chief negotiator of South Africa and putting on a hat that is Pan-African. And so consensus building, the ability to build consensus and to move in the same direction, the ability to move competing national, regional objectives is going to be key. So that is something that is going to be a critical, I think, not just for me, for any Secretary General. You will need to have skills in consensus building, because you are only as successful as you are able to persuade member states towards a particular direction. My initial priority before COVID-19 was going to be to focus on building the institution, ensuring that we have a secretariat that is staffed by competent professionals, competent Africans, competent in trade law, in development, competent African trade economists, and still, of course, an important objective. But as I was saying earlier, we now have a crisis that has underscored the need to probably expand the list of priorities. But in terms of the support that we will require, I want to establish a center for trade and development excellence at the Secretariat, within the Secretariat itself. I also indicated when I was campaigning, I also indicated that I want to establish a 2-year program for trade, young Africans, young trade graduates who may graduate from the University of, from Makerere University or the University of Lagos, who can come to the Secretariat and spend 2 years, who spend 2 years embedded working with us as young trade professionals. And for that, we will need support. We will need institutional support. We will need financial resources to be able to do that, so that we build the next generation of young African trade experts, whether they are trade lawyers, trade economists. It's very, very important that we build our own capacity, we build our own skills, and we equip young Africans who will be graduates of African universities. You see, if you are like me, you have your LLM from the London School of Economics, you have many, many options. You can go anywhere in the world, so we have to prioritize Africans who graduated from African universities in Africa in this 2-year program that we will establish. So support in formulating ideas and in establishing that program will also be very, very valuable from our partners around the world. You are number 1 on the list for the person to whom I will come to, knock on the doors for that. But I think it's very, very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency. I think we couldn't have had a better session. We still have many questions, but we know your time is valuable. I would like to give the floor to our Dean, Signe, for the final word.
Oh, thank you so much, Landry. And Your Excellency, as Landry has so eloquently put, we couldn't be more honored than having you here sharing not only the wisdom you've generated over many years of an incredible career, but your foresight into what is possible with the new trade institution. We are here, as I said, to be your humble partners and servants. We have a fantastic set of alumni across the continent and faculty, students ready to be at service. We are very bullish on Africa, as you know, as an African myself, is something that I care about very deeply and personally. And so thank you again. Please don't hesitate to reach out in any way that we can be supportive. I want to thank Landry, Philip Tigo, Monica Kretz-Mercau, Olivia Muera, and so many others that made this possible. All of our participants on the continent, around the world. This is part of an ongoing set of globinars we are doing to really, again, stay true to our principles of bringing the world together in times when even more there are forces that want to separate us. And that means cross-cultural respect and learning. That means being embracing the new possibilities of the fourth industrial revolution and the leadership it entails and requires. But it also means leading with compassion. And so whether those globinars are the ones we're doing on Africa, led by Professor Kretz-Mercau and Professor Signe and Philip Tigo and others, or those around the world, please join us. Please stay safe and healthy. Be compassionate with one another and help us help each other bring this world together during these difficult times. Thank you again, Your Excellency, and thank you, Landry. All the best, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much again.